Hello and welcome to the Classification Community Group. Today's 30-minute session will be a 15-minute presentation followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. To join our community group, go to the URL listed. Our topic today that we'll be covering is the 5 critical classification requirements you must know. Our presenter today is Richard Turner, and I am Jennifer Hudson. Thank you. Enjoy the meeting.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Richard Turner, as Jennifer noted. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today's community group meeting. I just want to make a note before I get going that we don't have time to go through all 5 of the critical classification requirements. We're going to go through the first one, which is a pretty important one. The remaining 4 we'll be sending out in a blog in about a week's time. Look for that. It'll have a lot more detail on the remaining 4 classification requirements. That being said, we're going to start with number 1. You see the list here. The first one that we'll talk about today is the cross-functional requirements. The other 2 are reports and analytics, search use cases, target system requirements, and global business requirements. So we have 5 use cases here that give everyone a good idea of the types of cross-functional requirements we recommend are collected early on in a classification initiative. The first one, most common, is engineering reuse. And what do we mean by that? It's making it easier for engineers to find parts. If you don't have the best data, engineers are not going to spend all day trying to look for an existing part. They're going to go out and create a new one. And that's just the fact of life. So you want to understand what it takes for engineers to easily find parts and gather those requirements. IT systems. You also want to talk with your IT group to find out what systems could take advantage of classification data. Today's PLM systems have very good support for PLM data. ERP systems also have requirements. And then there's business intelligence tools and analysis cubes. You may want to talk with those groups in the IT organization to find out what information they could use from your classification initiative. The supply chain could also benefit from your classification initiative. They may want to have certain commercial attributes in your data model, like purchase volumes, supplier data, manufacturer names. So you might want to speak with them to kind of understand what their requirements are before you get going on your initiative. Procurement may have something in the area of analytics. A lot of times procurement is doing a lot of cost savings these days with their direct material spend. And some of the things that they may be interested in are normalized commodity codes or a standard category code for all the direct materials, especially the purchase parts, to support their spend analytic initiatives. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, sales catalogs. It's very hard to sell products online when you don't have good quality information. And typically, selling products online requires a lot of information, including things like images. And we'll talk about how the classification initiative can support the sales organization. So let's start with engineering reuse. What we've found over the last 15 or so years in our experience is if an engineer can't find a part, we know where they're going to go to get one. They're going to go to Grainger, they're going to go to McMaster-Carr, they're going to go to these online distributors that have done a really good job with making it easy for them to sell parts. And they have adopted classification. You'll see they have nice categories and images and attribute filters to make it real easy to find a part within minutes. An example you can see on the screenshot here, if you visualize, if any of you have been on one of these websites, you typically navigate through a series of images until you get to a category. And here's an example of a category on the screenshot to the right of some bolts. When you finally get to that category, you'll see typically attribute filters on the left. If you start selecting these filters, it'll shrink the search result on the right. And the more attributes you select on the left, typically the smaller the search result gets to be, and it may get down to the 1 or 2 items you're most interested in. And like I was saying earlier, this typically takes a minute or 2 to get to the exact part you want. So what is an engineer going to do? Is he going to look through all your poor quality data, or are they going to go out to McMaster-Carr and create a new part? So you want to create a search experience that's very similar to these applications. And the PLM classification tools can do that today. Tools like Teamcenter and PartsLink from PTC and Siemens, those products now have better search capabilities, and they leverage classification data to do it. So you might want to understand how those systems work. And why do you do all this? Well, what's the cost of a new part? Some industries, it can be $5,000. In the aerospace industry, it may be $20,000 for an electronic component. These are the savings that you'll help your organization achieve when you can get engineers to reuse existing parts. IT systems. I thought I would provide a real simple example of an IT system. I mentioned it earlier. PLM systems support classification search. And here's an example of Team Center. And what you see on the screen, in the middle of the screen is a data model. You can build a data model, and that can be maintained in Team Center. You can have categories, and each one of these categories can have attributes. You can see the attributes listed here. And for each of the individual attributes, there'll be attribute values. All this information should be coming from your classification initiative. That will make these deployments work that much better if you can provide this information to the PLM systems. For the ERP systems, they may want simpler things like rationalize or normalize commodity codes, short and long part descriptions. So you can normalize this information and feed it into your ERP system like a JD Edwards or an SAP. And you can also talk to your organization using SpendCube tools and business intelligence tools and the sales portal, which I talked about earlier. You want to understand what are these systems requirements before you get too far with your classification initiative so you can support them with the data that they need. On the supply chain side, your supply chain organization may be interested in understanding who are we buying from for a particular category of commodities. In this example, we're looking at motors. So if you have a classification structure of purchase parts and you go to your motors category, which you have selected in the top left, you can then select an attribute. We're in our analytical tool and we selected manufacturer name. And this shows all the manufacturer names. And at the top of the list are the most common manufacturers for motors that you're buying from. You can see that these two manufacturers, Acme and General Electric, represent about 30% of the motors that you're buying today, 15 and 14% each. And conversely, you can look at the bottom of this chart, and you can look at some of the suppliers that may only be providing, or some of the manufacturers you may only be buying a few motors from. And those are the ones you may want to rationalize. You may just want to buy from a select group of manufacturers. Procurement can also benefit from your classification initiative. A lot of times the procurement group has direct material analytical programs going on where they need to analyze at a more granular level the direct material spend. And here's an example around bolts. One of the things that they're interested in is what are the most common bolts that they're buying today. So here's an analysis of bolts by head type. And you can see the most common ones start on the left. Looks like this company has 1,500 double hex and another 1,400 or so hexagon style head types for screws. And then you can see all the other ones are much smaller. So what you might want to do is focus your analysis on these hex head screws, since they represent close to 90% of the screws or bolts that you're buying today. Once you know that that's the area to focus your analytical analysis on for procurement, you may also want to do what we call a cluster analysis. So on the top right, here's a cluster analysis. We have a tool called the cluster analysis. And what you do is you can create a batch and feed that batch into the system and say that batch is all your hex head screws. And then you can further analyze these hex head screws. Since there's about 3,000 of them, you want to prioritize some of these attributes. So we got length has a weight factor of 10, head type has a weight factor, material has a weight factor, pitch, thread size. Those first 4 or 5 attributes all have weight factors. Then you set a neighbor distance, which we'll talk about what that is, and then you run the analysis. And what you see down below here is a cluster of 30 bolts that all have very similar characteristics. They have the same head type, very similar lengths, similar materials, the same pitch, the same thread size. But then if you bring in the commercial data, you start to notice cost savings opportunities. Some of these you're buying at a much lower price than others. A lot of that has to do with volume and what suppliers you're buying from. But this is the exact view that your procurement organization would like to have. They'd like to have this granular view to then look at opportunities for cost savings. This is just one category of screws, hex head bolts, and you can probably see that there's a significant amount of cost savings based on the volumes. If you rationalize some of these prices, you rationalize some of the suppliers you're buying from, that could be a significant cost savings. That supports procurement's analytical analysis. And the last area I want to talk about is the sales area. You want to talk to your sales organization because a lot of times you may be selling your products or your parts online. One of our customers, National Oil Well, leveraged their classification team to help them sell their products online, something they'd never done before until the last couple of years. Now they have this ability to make it easy for their customers to log onto their website and find the products they're most interested in, or to view multiple products. And how they do that is they're able to navigate the classification structure, and then they're able to filter on items based on attribute values shown here in the middle of the screen, and they're able to figure out what it is that they need to buy. They no longer have to call National Oil Well to figure out what they need to buy. On their own time, they can go to their website and they can do it at their leisure. So now they have a 24/7 sales process by being able to sell their products online. And this can be for end items. This could also be for service parts. So that's, so you want to understand early on in your classification initiative, are we just doing this for parts, for bills of material? Or are we also doing it for online sales? And if you're doing it for online sales, you might want to talk with those groups to gather those requirements to understand what information they need to sell things online. And typically it's a lot more data to sell products online that you need to collect. You may also need to collect images and what have you to make it easy to enable that process. So those are the 5 examples or 5 use cases for the cross-functional requirements. So what we recommend in summary, that you meet with your functional leaders in your organization, talk to them, gather their requirements, educate them on the power of classification. You want to build up sponsorship. Sometimes you're going to have to show them examples because they've never had the type of data that classification can provide. You might want to show them what things could look like in the future. You want to obtain those requirements early on in the project. You don't want to be doing it later on in the project where you're going to end up having to redo things. So the earlier you can collect this information, the better the chances are that you'll get it right the first time. So I recommend that you talk to these functional organizations early on in your project. Another thing you can do as your project progresses is to keep these functional leaders supporting your initiative is creating reports, sending them examples of the value of classification. One of the things that we do with our customers is we'll analyze a category. We do it through a DVA analysis or data value analysis. We'll show them the types of information that we can produce for one category, and we'll also show them the opportunities for cost savings, and we'll also show them various trends in the data. That will all be captured in a single report that can be distributed to management. And that will get their attention and understand the value of your initiative. So it's an important thing that you're always communicating with the executives on the value of what you do by sending out these examples and sending out these reports. So there's 4 other areas that we don't have time to talk about, but like I said earlier in this meeting, that we'll be sending out a blog that will be talking in more detail about this area and the 4 other areas, 4 other key requirement areas. Look for that blog to be coming out in the near future.
Well, Rich, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative, and I hope everyone's looking forward to the blog. We will be recording this session and distributing it, so if anyone missed it, we will be providing this recorded session on our website. Right now, we want to open the floor to questions. You have the option in this webinar to raise your hand and ask a question out loud, or you can type in your question using the question feature. So if anyone has any questions at this time, please submit them. Well, while we wait for the audience to submit a question, we did have a couple of online submissions of questions in advance of the webinar. Sandra asked a question, Rich, how do I get executive buy-in to do this work?
That's a good question. If you don't get the executive buy-in up front, you're not going to get the support, the resources, the budget you need to do this type of project. So what I highly recommend you do is you start a very small pilot and you provide an example to your executives of what classification can do for your business. And you want to talk to all the functional areas, get their buy-in, and present it to the leadership. And I think that would really help get your program off the ground and give you the support that you need.
Well, thank you for that answer. We do have a question from the audience. Robin, go ahead.
Basically, it was the same question that Sandra had there. I wanted to understand how we get the other functional areas also excited about this, because right now they kind of have some of their own systems that they think are very good.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Robin. We're not necessarily talking about replacing their system, but providing them better data for their systems. So I think if you could look, Robin, at the systems they have and understand, do they have issues with the data that they have in those systems? Try to understand those issues and then see if there's ways that you could provide them higher quality information from your classification initiative to allow them to do the things that they want to be able to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Robin, thank you very much for that question. We had another online submission prior to the webinar from Joe. Rich, he wanted to know, how do I get support from these functional areas?
Well, one of the things that you could do is set up a cross-functional governance board where you're meeting with them, not on a weekly basis, because obviously these people have other jobs to do, but maybe on a monthly basis, you meet with them and give them an update on what is it you're trying to achieve, what is it you're doing, and basically get them on the hook to support your project and make sure that you understand their requirements so that when you ask for their help, they see the value you're providing to their functional group. So I recommend setting up a governance board that you meet with on a monthly basis. And this is not the same as your weekly status meetings. This is a group that you would just present back on a monthly basis.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else in the audience have questions? Feel free to type them in or raise your hand. So we have another question from online, Rich. We have a question from Sam. When is a good time to do this type of work?
So, companies have different initiatives going on. Some of the trigger points is if you're about to implement, say, a corporate-wide ERP or PLM system, that would be a good time to get a hold of your data, because I don't think you want to take the information in the state it's in today, especially if you have all these different businesses working independently of each other. You just don't want to put that into your corporate PLM or ERP system, because all you're doing is introducing poor quality data and most likely a lot of duplicates. So that's usually a trigger. Those systems are very expensive. They cost millions of dollars. So why would you want to put poor quality data in them? So that would be a good time to talk with executives to get the support to do this type of work. Now, if you're a company that's grown through acquisition, then you're definitely a very good candidate to do this type of work as well. So that would be another trigger. If you've grown through acquisition, or if your direct material spend is much higher than your competitors, those are all good triggers to leverage to use as a way to get this this type of initiative going.
Great, thank you for your answer, Rich. Does anybody else in the audience have additional questions? You can type them into the chat or raise your hand using the feature of the webinar.
I've got one that while people are waiting that kind of crossed my mind is the sales portal example. Let me go back to it. If I can move my screen. There's a data model in here for products, right? These are end items that you're selling online. That data model may be different than the one you have for parts. So you can have two different data models. They don't necessarily have to be the same, or classification structures. Maybe that's a better term to use. I know that with National Oil Well, they had a separate classification structure for their end items to support their online sales. That was different than the parts structure that they have supporting bills of material and PLM systems. So that's something that you want to make sure you think about very carefully early on before you get too far down the road, how you want to support, B2B initiatives and B2C initiatives.
Well, thank you, Rich, for this information. Thank you, everyone, for joining the meeting. Have a wonderful day. And again, if you have not joined the community classification group, please click on the URL listed and become a member today.